Skip forward. So for Asian migration, we're going to first start off with the Chinese migration in the 1800s, and you have to look at the Transcontinental Railroad when the United States was trying to build a railroad that was going to link the east to the west coast, and that's what's going on here in this particular image. You see the railroad trying to get all the way out here. Once the railroad was completed, the United States government passed a series of immigration restrictions. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which eventually would lead to the Oriental Exclusion Act. Notice how I use the term Chinese. Why? Because Chinese were the group coming over here in the 1800s to build the railroad. I showed you that image before. Eventually, you would start to see Japanese come over, and then I'll just put OA for other Asians, which is the reason why you see this Oriental Exclusion Act. I guess it's more like an umbrella term. So on this slide, we see some of the immigration restriction laws that were in place, first targeting the Chinese. And they say not even for family reunification, which meant if you showed up to build that railroad in the 1800s and you were going to send for your family, this says you cannot send for your family. So here's your family, you have your wife, you have your kid. Not even for family reunification would put you in a position where you would either have to not see your family again or you would have to go back. And so the whole goal here is to restrict immigration. Let's see. Here we're looking at a series of laws that were in the 1800s in California. And notice the use of terms non white. Here we see different racial terms here. This would be an umbrella term um, that would be used in the 1800s. And I know that I'm kind of lumping Chinese and Japanese and Asian in one category here, but that is intentional as we're looking at some of these laws, and these laws really seem to deal with some of the complexities of race. Here we see Chinese. Let's see. We have white, non-white, and so the reason why that's becoming problematic. Again, we address the issue of race being a social construct, and so in this article here, the San Francisco mayor he wants the Exclusion Act to also bar the Japanese. So the mayor of San Francisco is arguing this. We first started with the Chinese coming over here, but now we're starting to see a situation where the Japanese are also coming over here. So the mayor wants the Exclusion Act to also include this group, the Japanese. And he makes some arguments here. He says that the Japanese is enlightened, and he also says that the Japanese, in comparison to the Chinese, want to own property, which makes them dangerous, hence the name of the article. Here we see some additional laws targeting or acts that were designed to restrict immigration. Notice we see in 1943 they repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This slide is looking at immigration statistics from the 1920s, and you can see Asia really falling behind in comparison to European immigration, and that's a result of those Chinese exclusion acts. One in particular could be the United States versus W.I.T.C.H, and he would be one of those individuals that's lumped into this Oriental Exclusion Act. If you're wondering, well, if he's from India, how does that actually work? Well, that just shows the complexities in race. So in his case, he's trying to argue that he's an Aryan, which would make him Caucasian, and that becomes his racial definition. It doesn't matter because he is not successful convincing the court that he is Aryan, and that is his particular situation. So at the end of the day, we're talking about these exclusion acts restricting who can become a citizen for those here, as well as who can come over here. We see that in this 1920s cartoon that was used to look at the peak of immigration in the 20s. The JACL was an organization, a Japanese organization that was advocating since before the 1960s. And what you're going to see here is that there's going to be a law in 1965 that's going to really help with Asian migration. So here we see 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, and that's going to lead to a situation where you're going to start to see other than Chinese starting to migrate to the United States. Why? Because this is now removed. Last group we'll be looking at is the disability, putting that in quotes, civil rights movement. And here we see legislation passed in 1973, this Rehabilitation Act, that is going to look at discrimination for people with medical conditions. And here they use the term here. At a glance, 501, employment discriminations, and then we see 502, which is looking at things like ramp access. So it's pretty simple. I mean, things like a ramp access prior to this would be totally allowed. And you could see that in this protest movement here. When we look at the back of this individual in a wheelchair, he says, I can't even get to the back of the bus. And so he's arguing, which is eventually going to lead to this particular piece of legislation being passed. Ed Roberts was a student trying to get into Berkeley. He initially was accepted, and then they refused admitting him because of the medical condition that he has, primarily because it would lead to a situation where they would have to modify the dorm. So he is also going to be somebody who is going to challenge it. Notice he is the founder of the independent living movement. So that's it for the other groups, the civil rights movement that we've been looking at throughout this